Everyone got super quiet. Hi, is everyone ready to start? Because I think y'all got really quiet. Well, hello everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. It's really exciting to see such a great group of people here this evening. In case you did not know where you are, this is Left Bank Books and ReLeaf of Missouri presents Dr. Christine Carmichael, the founder and principal consultant of Fair Forest Consulting. Tonight, Dr. Carmichael will be discussing her new book, Racist Roots, how racism has affected trees and people in our cities and what we can do about it. This book will show you what environmental justice truly means, as well as how you can make the most of your involvement in the movement to grow past our racist roots into a fairer future for urban forests and the people in our communities. I will say more about Dr. Carmichael in just a moment, but I want to thank you all so much for supporting this event. This event is possible because of you. When you support Left Bank Books, when you buy a book, not only are you keeping our bookstore open, paying me. By the way, I'm Shane Mullen. I'm the event coordinator. I haven't done an introduction in a while, so I'm really excited to stand in front of a crowd and talk. Not only does your money support Left Bank Books, but it also goes back into your community at an incredibly higher rate when you support local. It helps pave your streets. It helps keep the libraries free and funded, the parks open. So your money does a lot more good when you spend it locally. So thank you so much for supporting Left Bank Books. We do have books available for sale at the desk. They will be available for sale after the event as well. So thank you so much for being here. A little bit about tonight's book. I will let them cover most of the things, but about our book, I will say, did you know that racism in America has not only affected people's social and political views, but it has also affected our city's urban trees and green spaces? This is something that I'm certain most of you have been thinking about, and most of you will be excited to hear about this evening. Dr. Christine Carmichael is the founder and principal consultant of Fair Forest Consulting, LLC. From training students and professionals on what environmental justice means, to facilitating productive dialogue among diverse groups on how to achieve environmental justice through urban forestry, to assisting organizations in writing grant proposals to advance environmental justice goals through urban forestry. Dr. Carmichael works with municipal, state, and federal government agencies, as well as nonprofit organizations like the incredible ReLeaf, across the U.S. to develop inclusive community engagement plans for urban forestry planning processes. In addition, Dr. Carmichael holds a Ph.D. in forestry with a specialization in gender, justice, and environmental change. Glad that exists in the world. And was selected as an honorary member of the Society of Municipal Arborists in 2022 for outstanding contributions to the urban forestry profession as a researcher, author, and educator. In her free time, Christine likes to go for hikes, read historical fiction, volunteer at a healing center for grieving children, and do karaoke at the local LGBTQ+ friendly bar in Lansing, Michigan, where she lives. Tonight, Dr. Carmichael will be in conversation with Missouri Forest ReLeaf Partnership Manager, Rebecca Hankins. Now, without further ado, if you would all please help me in welcoming our incredible guests for this evening, Dr. Christine Carmichael and Rebecca Hankins.
Thank you. And I think we're going to also have a short introduction from Meredith Perkins.
Hey everyone, I will definitely not take much of your time. I'm Meredith Perkins. I'm the Executive Director with Forest ReLeaf of Missouri. So great to see so many familiar faces and lots of new faces in the crowd today. Thank you again for coming. I wanted to just kind of connect the dots for why Forest ReLeaf is so excited and proud to host Dr. Carmichael. She's in town this week for a board training for our Forest ReLeaf board. Forest ReLeaf has centered environmental justice for probably the last 15 or so years. We've been working through our programming, particularly called Priority Relief, where we have been investing in frontline communities and low canopy areas. But as we become more strategic about where we need trees, we're starting to learn, thankfully from research like Dr. Carmichael and others, what kinds of things led to that injustice and how we can start to change what we do as an organization in order to do better. Forest ReLeaf has been 30 years planting trees and enriching communities. That's our motto, that's our mission, that's what we hang our hat on every day. And every day we're learning from the research and the community. And that's, I think, what we're going to hear about today is really transitioning from an expert approach. I'm an arborist and a forester by training and have been doing urban forestry for decades now too. And it's always been about what we know the science is telling us and what we know the trees should be, what nature needs. And what we really want to be working on in our urban spaces is also recognizing what our communities need, and what those are hyper locally is going to change from Kingsway East to Vanna Manor to Tower Grove South to Dutchtown. We're all looking for goals and priorities in our communities to make our communities stronger, and trees are going to be part of that solution. So we're grateful that Dr. Carmichael is here. We're grateful that she wrote an easily digestible book that gets outside of academia, gets outside of the industry, and hopefully speaks to all of you. So read it, share it with your friends and your neighbors, and join us in this effort. And without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Carmichael. She's already been here. She's been a great friend, and I've been a fangirl for a long time of hers, but also on our team, Rebecca Hankins, our amazing partnership manager, has been with Forest ReLeaf since 2020 and has really transformed the programming that we do in environmental justice. And so hopefully you'll enjoy the conversation. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and I think I want to hand it off to you, Rebecca, to get us started.
Thank you, Christine. As Meredith mentioned, I've been on staff for the last 3 years, and as we've really started to deep dive into this community work, there was no roadmap for how to do it. I just got out there, and so this is why I'm really excited to talk with Christine today about her book, because it is a roadmap for so many of us who are doing this work and who want to get involved in this work. So Christine, I wanted to ask you about how you opened the book. You talk about an abundance mindset versus a scarcity mindset. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think if anyone's read the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I think that maybe is where the term abundance mindset was coined. I learned about it through some colleagues of mine, Joel Pinnell, who's at American Forest, and Sarah Lily Sewell, who's a consultant as well. But really what the reason I put the abundance mindset and scarcity mindset into the book and had it as a thread throughout is because racism really depends on a scarcity mindset, which means that there's a pie. The idea is that there's a pie, and if one person gets a piece, another person can't get that piece. And so there's this idea that we need to compete over scarce resources, and if one person gets something, someone else can't. And an abundance mindset is not necessarily saying we have unlimited resources, because we don't. All of our resources are limited to a degree, but there's an abundance of opportunities. If we focus on not necessarily what we don't have, but we focus on what we could create through all the opportunities around us, the relationships we have with other people, the internal fortitude you might have within yourself is a resource that's quite abundant, or can be, to get us through adversity. There's a lot of abundance that we can really tap into in terms of opportunities to address problems in really creative ways. So a lot of times we hear in urban forestry that there's not funding for certain problems, but one example of shifting to an abundance mindset, for example, in the book I talk about Theaster Gates, who's an artist in Chicago, and they were having a real problem with ash trees dying because of emerald ash borer, which is an invasive insect. And so they had this problem, but they also had this issue of, well, what are we going to do about it that's going to be helpful to the community? So he helped set up a lumber mill and employ local people in that effort to take what was a resource that nobody really necessarily knew what to do with. It was kind of a liability, these dead ash trees, and turned it into an opportunity to really create work opportunities. They created products that were used in the community, tables and other products, chairs that they could use. And so really taking something that was, what do we not have, and shifting it to what can we create? And what partnerships can we create? There's such an abundance of opportunities. So I think it's really important just thinking about that there's enough for everybody and that it's not a competition of, one person gets something and I don't. And the great thing about trees too is just that they passively kind of give a lot to a lot of people. And by giving clean air to one person, it's not taking away clean air from another person, for instance.
I love that, Christine. It's so important to keep that in mind. And another thing to keep in mind is the history, how we got to this point of, feeling that scarcity mindset so that we can change it to be that abundant mindset. A quote that I really love that you say in the book is, I find this practice of marking neighborhoods as hazards based on race not only tragic and horribly misguided, but also ironic. White people at that time created hazards for people of color. What do you mean by marking neighborhoods as hazards? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so this is referring to redlining, which was a policy in the 1930s. So right after the Great Depression, the federal government established the Homeowners Loan Corporation to basically try to help families access mortgages at an affordable rate to become homeowners. The problem was that they sent out surveyors to neighborhoods and said, you can mark a neighborhood as the lowest, least desirable, the most hazardous for investors based on the proportion of people of color living there. Regardless of anything else, how the neighborhood looks or the appearance or how well kept up the properties are, none of that mattered. And so those areas were redlined and therefore didn't get access to mortgages. And so those areas were basically then put into land uses like polluting land uses, decreasing property values. So a lot of times, especially Black families, were not able to access mortgages. And if you think about that lack of investment, a lot of tree care in cities is paid for through property taxes. So if you have neighborhoods specifically being left out of investment, of mortgages, of opportunities, economic opportunities to earn a wage to then pay for property taxes and pay for tree care, all of that was essentially taken away through this process of redlining. And actually, I did want to get to you too, because we were talking about this with St. Louis.
Yes.
And how that played out in St. Louis.
Learning about redlining for me was really eye-opening. It was not something I knew really before doing this work. And when I studied the redline maps of St. Louis and I overlaid those with urban tree canopy maps, exactly what you had said, that there's a direct correlation between neighborhoods that were redlined and those that are now suffering from lower tree canopy. And I talk about this in presentations as I am advocating for a better urban tree canopy and the impacts that lower tree canopy has on St. Louis, on our city. And so next week, I'm actually giving a talk on those health impacts. So if you're interested in learning more specifically about St. Louis, I will be doing a virtual talk at the St. Louis County Library through the Partners in Native Landscaping.
Yeah, that's super exciting just to get. I think some people think, well, that was almost 100 years ago, but we see the impacts of that happening and playing out today. And I think it's just so important that people are grounded in understanding how the history is present still today. And unless we have intentional interventions and we go to the community members who are most affected first, we're not going to necessarily be able to get out of this system unless we are aware of it and intentionally intervene.
So as we move through the book, you start to help people begin to understand how they can, one, learn about redlining, but then what can they do about it? And two quotes that you mentioned in chapter 2 that I really like are, it is helpful to know more about your own perspectives so that you can avoid projecting your values and judgments onto the residents of neighborhoods in which you hope to plant trees. Additionally, you go on to say, planting trees is relatively easy and less time-consuming compared to long-term community engagement, and it can feel like an empowering, tangible action to address lots of big, scary problems such as climate change, without having to do the hard work of reflecting on the truths of racist systems and processes within which we all operate. Putting a tree in the ground can feel nice and helpful in the moment, but it is a tragedy waiting to happen if it isn't cared for and residents' needs and feelings are ignored.
You want to talk more about that?
Yeah, so when I started this research, I had grown up in a suburb of Lansing, Michigan called Mason, predominantly white middle-class suburb, surrounded by well-maintained street trees. And I didn't really think anything of that. I thought that that was just maybe everybody's experience. And so when I went to Michigan State to do my Ph.D., and my advisor was on the board of directors for the Greening of Detroit, which was the organization a nonprofit that was planting street trees throughout the city, because like many of the redlined areas, the trees had declined and there was far fewer trees in those areas. And she came to me and said, they have this problem where residents are submitting no tree requests and saying, no, I don't want you to plant the tree there. And my first response internally was, who wouldn't want a tree? And that goes to show you what my lens and my experience was and how I was basically coming to the problem having had overwhelmingly positive experiences with trees. And so my mindset was that everyone should want a tree, or trees can only be beneficial to people. And when I went to Detroit, I did more of the qualitative research, which we are sorely lacking and need a lot more of in urban forestry because it's such a human-centered activity. But really talking to residents, I learned so much about all of the difficulties they'd had with trees that had not been maintained. There were some trees that were quite large that had been planted decades before and left. And then there were large branches falling, trees falling on houses. Even the newer trees that were planted, the nonprofit told me, we only have so many resources. If we're planting thousands of trees, more trees every year, we don't have the resources to keep caring for those trees. And so then once I started to put myself in the position of the residents, I understood that planting the tree itself, it might feel good, especially to someone from an outside trying to come in and maybe help in a community. But if you're not thinking through the long term, who's going to take care of this tree? How are we going to make sure that this tree thrives and provides benefits? But also, how are residents who are the most closely affected and have the closest relationship with that tree, how are they involved in deciding what type of tree should we plant here? All of those decisions were being made by the nonprofit. And a lot of the people in the nonprofit were similar to me, where they had grown up in other places that were more middle class, predominantly white. And they thought, they kind of, in a way, and this is not to be overly critical, but had blinders on about that not everyone has those great experiences, and that people's concerns and desires for being involved in the decisions about trees and really having more serious conversations about maintenance and who's going to take care of the trees, that was so needed. And that's really what people wanted in order to say yes to a tree. So that's one of those things that I think is it's a lifelong learning process. It requires a great deal of humility, curiosity, compassion, and care and consideration, and centering the people who are most closely affected. And there's, I think in chapter 3, there was like 5 steps. So if you're curious, I lay out 5 steps that really anyone can follow if you're interested in trying to do more equitable, community-centered approaches to urban forestry. And I think maybe Rebecca, you could talk a little bit about how you work with communities in St. Louis to kind of integrate some of those principles, and maybe this idea of avoiding projecting our own values onto residents.
Yeah, it really does take a lot of conversations. It is getting out there, being visible, talking, building that trust happens over many conversations, over many months, over years sometimes. And we had an opportunity to have an environmental justice grant through the Arbor Day Foundation, and we worked in the greater Ville neighborhoods, and it really took a while for the neighbors to come out and begin to see that we were going to continue to show up. And now I'm affectionately known as the tree lady, and which is wonderful. And it's just, it takes a lot more time though than people realize, but it is so rewarding when it happens.
Mm-hmm.
There was an instance in Fairground Park where we planted trees this past spring, and we engaged with an artist, and we did a community wrapping project to protect the trees, but to draw attention to the trees. And the planting, it was a really cold, windy April 1st. And so we had to come back the next weekend. It was unplanned, unscheduled. And when we showed up, it was sunny the next Saturday. All the neighbors came out and they said, well, what are you doing? We saw you last week. We were inside watching. And so we explained what we were doing, and that's when the magic happened. And so just being able to engage communities at that level, of drawing them into the work that we're doing, inviting them to be a part of it, listening to what their needs are, what they wanted. We had been talking with the community at large, and one of the things we heard loudly was they wanted beautification. And so, we made an effort to plant cherry trees. So we're really excited to see those bloom this year. And so it is just such a rewarding process, but it really does take stepping back, not putting my own perspectives and projecting those onto the community, like you said, and listening. So that's really wonderful.
Yeah, and I think you had mentioned too, there was a workshop actually just recently. I don't know if that's what you want to segue into next.
Yeah, so in chapter 5, you talk about barriers. And for those of you who are getting ready to read the book, I'm just going to call us out here. So in chapter 5, she mentions a participant from St. Louis, which is me. And a year ago, we were in a training with Dr. Carmichael, and I talked about a program that we were piloting in the 24-1 called Resilience. And one of the consternations I was dealing with at the moment was we were removing dead, dying trees from private properties. So we were addressing a real issue for homeowners. But then when it was time to take the replacement tree, we were getting pushback from homeowners. And I didn't know what to do with that because I didn't expect that to happen. And so I had brought this up in our training, and we had some success. There was a measure of many conversations and some convincing on my part for certain homeowners. But even when we then went back, sometimes that convincing wasn't enough to keep the tree alive. Homeowners just didn't water the tree because they just didn't want the tree. They felt obligated to take the tree. So after a year of not meeting with full success, we had a workshop this past January with participants from the program, with community-based organizations, with local government, and we invited them in, and we talked about this challenge that we were facing in this program. And we actually came away with a lot of great ideas to solve that problem. And so when we stepped back and really listened to the community and the needs, we came away with ideas to promote that tree love by addressing the hurt that people were experiencing from the dead, dying tree on their property, those dropped limbs, the stress and anguish with every passing storm. Was that tree going to fall on my house, on my property, on my car? And that builds trauma over time. And so as we get ready to roll this program out in the city, one of the things we want to do is have a workshop where we address that trauma with residents to help them be prepared to take that new tree. And so that's part of what we call restorative justice. And we feel that that's really important. It's not just about that future tree that's getting planted. There's so much more that has to go into that consideration. I think you mentioned that in the book, it's the before and the after the tree planting occurs that's actually the most important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the key factors that distinguishes urban forestry from other forms of forestry is that these trees are in neighborhoods around people all the time. There's a relationship, and it can be a positive one, it can be a negative one, it can be a mixed bag. But a lot of people have traumatic experiences, and so I think it's really wonderful and important that there's this effort with your organization to help people have a venue to talk about those experiences, and hopefully restorative justice is about really understanding accountability for the past and then coming to an agreed upon future solution. And so that might mean people want to wait a beat before they take a new tree, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to support your vision of helping to reforest the city. It just might mean on their property immediately, they may be like, well, I'm going to need a minute, but I'll help you maybe, find homes for trees in other places or other things like that. If they feel like their experience is held in a safe space.
And, so that just shows that even people like me who are doing this work day in and day out, we're learning and growing, and how much in a year things have changed. And so this is why I'm so excited that you've written this book and that you are sharing the knowledge that you are gaining, because it really did help me to step back and examine what I could be doing better. And so, this is just such a fantastic opportunity to help all of us to grow in our understanding of ourselves, to address problems like racism, and it can be even beyond urban forestry.
Yeah, and I think also it's just so important I try in the book to talk about my own shortcomings and my own growing, learning journey, because I think it's really important to normalize that we're all grow up in this society and are, in either implicitly or explicitly taught things about race and it's important that we understand that it's up to us and we have the power to examine and reflect, and that's hopefully what the book helps to do on our own experiences and to then hold space for someone who might have different experiences or similar experiences, but that it's all valid and it's all important in this discussion about what does the future look like. I think it's really tempting in a lot of it's not just you to be like, how do we educate people about how great trees are? And I think the really big thing there is to inquire into our assumptions and say, well, do people really not care about trees, or is that really the problem? And in Detroit, it was not necessarily the problem. And people said, oh yeah, trees are great, they have shade and all of that, but there were all of these other compounding issues that needed to be given attention. And it's this whole idea of the scarcity mindset, like we don't have enough time, we have to get everything done and quickly and get as many trees planted as possible. But that's what I mean by it's a tragedy waiting to happen. In cases, there's research showing where the trees, if they're not stewarded or the community is not engaged, the trees can end up dying more often than not. And then you kind of have to go back to square one. So it's like important for us to at least be aware that there might be some impatience, especially with things like climate change happening, to get things done as quickly as possible, but we have to think more about sustainability as well.
One of the things that I really love that you do in this book is in every chapter you often offer questions to consider. So you really help the reader reflect on what you're saying and have them do that deep internal reflection to begin to make change within themselves. In chapter 6, I believe, you ask people to consider what adversity they have faced in life, what did they do to overcome it, and what characteristics did that require of them. And I think that applies even beyond urban forestry, and it goes back to that abundance mindset that you laid out at the very beginning of the book, which is amazing. And you talk about celebrating as part of that abundance.
Mm-hmm.
And do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so a lot of times, I talk a little bit about throughout the book about we live in a capitalist model, which is oftentimes, especially as a millennial in the room, I grew up with this idea that, my self-worth was attached to my productivity and being productive as much as possible, doing as much as possible, being active. But in nature teaches us to rest and restore. Communities are also saying, we need, if we want to keep momentum for a long-term initiative, which is what this is, this trying to improve urban forests is a long-term goal. Trees take some time to grow, and they're teaching us things about being patient, but also taking time to celebrate and rejuvenate our energy. And I think one of the things, to be doing is thinking like Arbor Day is one of these celebrations. It's like once a year, like Earth Day, and everyone can get together and celebrate trees, but a lot of times there's not necessarily consideration of like different cultural traditions around trees. How can we celebrate those? And how can we make it not just one day a year, but rather have it be more of a balanced approach so that, because people inevitably aren't going to keep coming back to do all of this difficult work unless there's also something that's rewarding with it. And I think, and having the abundance mindset too, I think, it encourages us to think about abundance not in terms of material wealth, but in terms of the abundance of opportunities to have connection and belonging. That can be for all of us, right? And so, and there's no shortage on that if we can go about this in the way of valuing each other, right, and each other's experiences.
Well, Christine, I have to plug our Arbor Day celebration that's coming up on April 27th, because we're really excited about that, celebrating and connecting with communities. We will be really highlighting trees and how, and around air quality. So asthma and allergies and pollen, but we'll also be celebrating with yoga session and just having a connection to nature and to the earth and that grounding that trees provide. So we will be doing a giveaway of trees, but we recognize not everybody can take a tree, right? Not everybody has a home, or maybe they already have a tree in their yard. A lot of people are renters. And so being able to invite the entire community to come out and celebrate trees with us is really important to us as we move forward. So we're really excited. So mark your calendars for April 27th, y'all.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we were talking a little bit just about, I don't know how we're doing on time. I think we're actually right around when we hope to kind of wrap this up. But yeah, I really hope that, the questions to consider are there for people to engage with. There's also a dream tree throughout the book at the end of each chapter.
I love the dream tree.
It helps you kind of think about dreaming without limits. If you had the ideal future for the urban forests around you, what would that look like? What might be the barriers that get in your way? And it's okay to acknowledge barriers. A lot of times barriers, can be very frustrating to confront, but it's really a lesson. It's teaching us something. It's almost like when water's going down a stream and it hits a rock. It goes around, it finds a way to just keep flowing, but it learns to acknowledge that the rock is there. There is a barrier. But it's teaching us, and I think your example of the workshops to help people talk about their trauma with trees is an example of like, that was a barrier. Educating people about trees wasn't helping with that barrier necessarily. It can be one tool, but really getting deeper and saying, we're gonna say no to the scarcity mindset that says we don't have time to do this. And we're gonna say yes to the opportunity this provides us to really confront a barrier and find a way to work through it.
Definitely. And I would just like to say one final quote from your book to leave the audience before we go into Q&A. You are a crucial voice in the movement to eradicate racism from major societal institutions that require intentional focus and commitment indefinitely. So with that, I think we're ready to open up to Q&A.
So anybody have a question? Yes, Gloria.
Whenever you explain the experience of like feeling like, why doesn't everybody love trees? And then realizing that came from a place of privilege I feel like I had a parallel experience. How do you feel like I don't know how to like explain that to other people without necessarily like stepping on toes.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you're just trying to love nature and think it's perfect, and I get that because I felt that way too. But yeah,
I think that you just said it right there. You just said to that if someone says that they don't understand why someone would want a tree, is saying, yeah, from your experience that doesn't make sense, and I had that experience too. But there's so many different types of experiences people have with trees. And so it's an opportunity to validate that that is that person's experience and not shame anybody for, and to say, yeah, it's understandable that that's your viewpoint because that's been your experience. And then encouraging or giving the opportunity to someone like what you're saying to say, hey, there's other ways, other experiences people are having with trees, like in Detroit or in St. Louis, and then that can open up that conversation, I think. So I'm always someone who's going to vote against shaming because it doesn't really help. And actually, Loretta J. Ross is a professor who talks about calling in versus calling out and this culture, and I would highly recommend her website and podcasts and trainings. But she talks about how when you call someone out, it's usually shaming someone for either saying something that you think is ignorant or bigoted or things like that. And it actually can make someone more entrenched and resistant to change. Calling in is like a call out, but it's done with love and respect. And so it's something like privately, you would talk to someone and say, hey, I noticed you said this, and I'm wondering if you've considered this as well, and validating that that's their perspective. But I think that that's a really useful framework that Professor Ross provides.
Yes, I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes.
Thank you for this really very informative program. I was thinking in terms of sustainability, though, so we encourage the community to take a tree, but is there money behind that tree? Like as it grows 5 years old, will the city come back and do the grooming of the tree so that it doesn't become a problem, or will they put dirt around the tree free of charge to the community, members of the community? What's the sustainability aspect of keeping those trees viable?
Yeah.
Because I know that sometimes that the community, we had flower beds at O'Fallon Park, but the community was expected to go up there with water jugs because we received half funding. We'll dig up the ground from you, but we won't install a water source. So then, the flower beds, after a couple of years, they die out.
Yeah, I would say in some of these situations, there's so many opportunities for partnership that could be helpful because any one group or any one entity, municipal government, whoever, is going to have limited ability and resources, but they also can have some privilege and they're connected to different networks, especially like city government. They're oftentimes working with different community groups, nonprofits. And so I think that's what you talked about with being expected to do things is something to avoid. And I would go back to if the city government or whoever it is says, we only have enough money to do this part of things, going back and pushing a little and saying, well, who do you know that you could connect us to that could help us with this other part? Because it's not going to be sustainable and your money and effort is going to be wasted if we don't have this whole pie or this whole piece figured out. And so I think sometimes pointing that out and directly asking them to use their privilege that, a person in the community may not be in all of those networks, but someone in the city government might be. And so I think sometimes that's what I would say is and there's been really good examples like the Garden of Healing in New Haven, Connecticut. It was a community identified desire to create a garden to commemorate. It was mothers who had lost their children to gun violence. And they went to the Urban Resources Initiative and they said, well, why don't we just plant a tree in your son's honor? And this woman said, no, we want something bigger that commemorates all the people who have lost children. And so the Urban Resource Initiative said, okay, let's use our privilege to advocate for funding from the state, from the city, from philanthropies, because they had all of those connections and they were able to secure those resources on behalf of a community identified desire and need. So I think sometimes, pointing out that privilege is there and should be used for good when possible. Yeah, I don't know, Rebecca, do you have anything you want to add on that?
I mean, just like what you said, I mean, different entities are limited in what they can do, but extending their reach by partnerships and synergies is really important. And I think we're all recognizing that leaning into these partnerships is helping everyone. So.
Yes.
So you talked about our capital society. So are there models out there, maybe not in the US, but wherever, where companies will pay, if we put a value on clean air or whatever other natural resource the trees help provide, where companies can be like, oh, I'm gonna make a carbon offset by supporting endeavors like Forestry ReLeaf has, or what you're talking about here?
There is actually a model in the US called City Forest Credits, and they work with companies that want to do what you're talking about, carbon offsets or other types of projects, and they help certify different and connect them to local projects that they can support. So that's one example I know of. I'm not sure, Rebecca, if you know of any others.
I don't, and I know Meredith has potentially maybe some insight into it, but I'm not familiar.
I will add just that what we have seen historically is that previously people didn't want to fund anything beyond just the tree. Like Dr. Carmichael mentioned, feels good, they get your employees out, plant a tree, pat yourself on the back, go have a party. And what we are seeing now is that if we ask these funders, if we say we can't just plant a tree and walk away, we are getting response from quality donors who are saying, recognizing they want to show up for the environmental justice component. And so they're not only paying for the tree planting, but also the stewardship, also the follow-up. And like Rebecca said, Forest ReLeaf doesn't always have the capability to go babysit that tree for 10 years, but we are getting funding and support built up, recognizing that getting that investment in establishment and follow-up care is important. So I think that there's momentum building for that.
It's funny because I think, instead of educating the community about trees and why they should accept trees, it's almost like educating funders about what the funding is really needed for. And if they want to have a good reputation in the community, if that's important to them, it's educating them about what's needed in order for that to happen. And what's needed is not a photo op on a tree planting day that might make you feel good, and it's not about you. And that's where I think we also, with white supremacy culture, need to get away from white saviorism of like going in and white saviorism. It's about how do I feel about myself in this moment? I feel good, and it's like a instant gratification almost. And that can't be your motivation. Your motivation has to be deeper than that. It has to be that you actually love and care for people, and you want to connect with them, and you want to create projects that everyone can feel that they're valued in that process. And so I think when we can educate funders about changing their approach, their lens, and what success means.
And actually, I would like to add that this leads to, like, what is that call to action? Everybody here may not be into urban forestry or know what to do, but each of you have access and privilege to something that can move the needle forward so that we have better cities with more trees. We're fighting the climate crisis. You have relationships with people that can potentially open up doors for organizations like Forest ReLeaf for the work that we're doing. And so just thinking about what you can do personally, I think is important, and leads me to a personal question. Who did you write this book for, Christine?
Yeah, I love that question. It's a process every author has to go through, is thinking about who is this book intended for. And I wanted this book obviously to be useful to people who are already in urban forestry, like Forest ReLeaf of Missouri, but also really importantly, I wanted it to be something that anyone who's interested in urban forestry, maybe in a community that's facing some of these issues of trees that have been neglected and they don't know where to start. They may not have the historical context or know about these different steps they can take. And so this book is really meant for that person who is not a professional forester and doesn't want to be a professional forester. They're a professional community member, basically, and they want to feel empowered to get involved. Then that was really one of the goals of the book, and the main purpose is to get it to people who could, get involved from just taking those initial steps, and maybe they're not involved yet, but this could inspire them.
I love that.
And I would point out, I'm not an arborist, so like I was sort of an outsider coming to urban forestry. I'm more of like a social scientist and things like that. So, but I've found that there are so many people in this profession that want to have open arms and welcome new people and new perspectives. And so I think that's what's exciting about what's happening now.
Same. I'm not an arborist myself. I'm actually have a horticulture background, and I just wanted to make a difference. Wanted to save green spaces, and so it's really exciting to be doing this work. And I love that it really does welcome anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, how are we doing on time? We still have a little time. Does anyone have any other questions? Yes.
So I think you had mentioned that in most communities from the government comes from property taxes.
Yes.
Is that the primary mode for funding that, or are there other sort of strategies? If
Yes.
You're not in a like high property tax community.
Right, property taxes do pay for tree care, but there is, so that the federal government has an urban and community forestry program, and each state has an urban and community forestry program as well, and they have a coordinator. It's kind of like those, Russian nesting dolls. So the states are within the federal government. The federal government gives money to the state, and the state urban community forestry program. And in the book, I point out that there's a website you can go to if you want to find out who your state urban and community forestry coordinator is. And their job is to basically take that federal funding and connect it to local community projects. So don't hesitate to reach out to them for sure. And I also talk about in the book, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in 2022, I believe, and had, I think, a 5-fold increase it was really a historical increase in funding for urban and community forestry programs. And I don't know if Rebecca, you want to expand on some of how that money is being used here. But there is more funding coming through now, which is unprecedented. And so really not being shy about reaching out to either your forest relief organization type thing or going to that state coordinator directly. In Michigan, our state forestry urban and community forestry coordinator is quite overwhelmed, but they, because of the funding, hired 2 new people. So it's very possible that in your case, the person has more staff now to help them and there's more capacities, which is really important. But I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, with that IRA money, we have been able to expand our tree resilience program. So that pilot that I was mentioning is expanding to St. Louis City, thanks to IRA funding. And I know the city of St. Louis also received funding for their forestry program. And you contact City Forestry for more information about how they'll be rolling out that additional funding.
Yeah, and I do see more corporations like stepping up in a way, like not all of them obviously, but like Target, for instance, was one corporate partner for the Arbor Day Foundation. And the Arbor Day Foundation, I was working with them and I made it very clear, you have to communicate to these corporate donors that it's not just a photo op for them and that they might not even get the photo op, that might not be part of this, that their role is more in the background.
And they listened,
support, and they
actually,
listened.
because we received that funding from the Arbor Day Foundation through Target, and we didn't even know it was Target in the beginning. They were really mum about the whole thing. So that's really awesome, and they really encouraged that deep involvement into the community and allowed us to take 2 years to really build those relationships. Because in the past, a lot of funding has been, you have to spend it right away, and not really allowing for that community building to happen. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, so I think all these conversations, it may feel like, oh gosh, what is my voice doing? But like Rebecca mentioned that quote at the end, it's so important that all of us realize how much power we really do have and our voice really does matter. in these conversations, yes. Yes?
During your community conversations, what are some reasons that people gave why they do want trees?
Yeah, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, the top 3 benefits of trees, when I asked people what could be the positives of planting trees in your neighborhood, were shade, beauty, and oxygen. And so, oxygen meaning like air quality, basically. So a lot of, and especially, I talk about this in the book as well, in majority communities of color, especially predominantly Black communities, the rates of asthma are astronomically higher. COVID-related deaths were twice as high for the Black community than it was for white residents. And so, a lot of people have that first and foremost on their mind, although there were some concerns about allergies and things like that. And I think Rebecca mentioned that there's an opportunity maybe to have more dialogue with residents about what are the risks of allergies or asthma, how do trees help with that, or what are the things we need to know. But yeah, basically people wanted beautification, they wanted shade, they wanted, clean air. And those were the top. And some people did mention other things like providing habitat for wildlife, or just helping the environment in general, or bringing their community together around something positive. Those were some of the major things people mentioned to me. Yeah, anybody else? Yes, Meredith.
I just sit in the back and think of all my questions.
Yeah,
I
no,
can
that's
ask them
welcome.
later, but one that I think what I love about your book is the tagline, what we can do about it. And I think that's the space that Forest ReLeaf is really activated. It's like, now we know, what are we gonna do about it? And you started off this conversation talking about pacing ourselves and being patient, and I admittedly am not that person, and I'm really working on it. But I also see the industry and the momentum that's building, the research and the work that you're doing, compounded with others across, the world really, that are investing in this. Can you speak to kind of the broader momentum and where you see the future of urban forestry with this lens kind of implemented to the best that we can?
Yeah, I mean, I did this research before sort of, I guess, the most recent major reckoning in the US around racial justice. So for me, it was like surprising that, it took things like the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd to like activate people, because it was like, these are issues that have been going on for a long time. And I see people, the positive, I suppose, is that people seem to more broadly, like that weren't involved, are more committed to the long term. Okay, I can't just, snap my fingers and make this problem go away. So I do see people committing more in general to racial justice and at least being curious about it. And I do see that the environmental justice movement is part of that. And I think that, especially as the world becomes more urbanized, 80%, I think at least, of our populations live in urban areas, and it's going to get more so that way. That the relationship people have with nature, that's something I see changing too, is that it's not always about going out to the big forest, and seeing trees in that context. It's about the relationship you have with the nature around you directly. It doesn't have to be really big, right? And I think that I see more and more organizations like yours helping people facilitate positive relationships and thinking about what is my value towards trees? What do I want my relationship to be with this tree? Rather than feeling like it's someone telling me, like the city's telling me they're gonna plant a tree here and I just have to take it or leave it. I really hope that as our profession evolves, we will find patience and stamina by looking at broader measures of success. Because even though if we may take longer to plant more trees, it's almost like if you're on a highway and there's construction and you have to go around, but it's quicker actually to go around than to try to go through all of the roadblocks that are there, I guess. So I don't know if this is helpful, but basically I'm trying to think and talk at the same time. But I think that along the way, even though it feels like a detour, wow, how much connection and belonging are we creating? How much community resilience and cohesion are we creating that can help us navigate things like the climate crisis or poverty or all of these other issues? Because we're getting people together, not just to plant a tree, but to talk about what is our relationships to each other through trees? What are our relationships with trees? How can I have a more active, empowered relationship with the nature around me? And so it's not just about experts telling people what they should want or designing something and then imposing it. It's more about giving people that space to decide for themselves. What do they want that relationship to be? Because I think the climate crisis in particular can be so disempowering, to feel like there's this huge issue, and what can I possibly do about it? But if you're able to say, wow, in my community, we're becoming empowered and having these relationships, and it's happening in other communities too, and that all adds up. It doesn't have to be one group or one organization or one person doing everything. It's really about everyone feeling like, even if it's something small, it's important.
I agree. It's not possible for just an organization like Forestry to do all the work, or for City Forestry or MDC. It's gonna take everyone to be a part of the movement. So I agree, Christine.
Yeah, hopefully that answered your question. Kind of meandered there a little, but yes, that's a good question. Yes, Kelly, and then over here.
I actually wanted to see if you could kind of expound on the whole idea of restorative justice when thinking about urban forestry and tree canopies, and maybe even a more in-depth approach, or what you may, some ideas of what you may
Yeah, I mean,
think that may
restorative.
look like.
Yeah, restorative justice is all about acknowledging past, harm that has been done and holding people accountable for that harm and coming to an agreement between the harmed person and the one who's done the harm about what a solution looks like. And so in the case of trees, it could be municipal government, could be a nonprofit like Forest ReLeaf facilitating dialogue between city government and residents who have been neglected and mistreated, and giving power to residents to say, what is it gonna take for some resolution of these past harms? And it might mean city government needs to step up in other ways that they haven't done, or they need to shift priorities and focus more on authentic engagement rather than, having a 311 line that anyone can call, but that's kind of a passive way to get people to get involved. And so I think that, and that's basically in restorative justice terms, what we would be looking for is venues where we could have productive dialogue between the harmed and those who have done harm, even if it's an institution and the person who's working at city government wasn't alive when such and such decision was made. You're still working for an institution, and you have to acknowledge that. And so that's what I would say as far as trees go, is having those opportunities to talk about solutions, and from the perspective of those who have been through all of the difficult experiences. Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one more question and then we have to wrap up. Yes.
I was just curious how you get the communities involved in helping to keep this sustainable in the long term after you guys leave, essentially.
Yeah, well, Rebecca, do you want to comment on that, or do you?
So we're still leaning into this work. And so I'm not sure we have a clear-cut answer to that. Trees in the public right-of-ways are city-owned trees. We are helping City Forestry with tree planting and tree maintenance through a new contract with the city. So we're really excited to be expanding that stewardship capacity to help the city. That's not currently something that it happens. Where trees on private property, it's tricky. You're dealing with people's, entering into a private, property space. So in our tree resilience program, homeowners sign a contract allowing us permission under their space. A lot of it will be empowering the resident to do this work, and also leaning into the community and inviting other community members. Maybe the youth can be involved. We can engage neighboring residents who may be more capable to participate. It's providing materials like buckets and hoses and things like that helps people be able to do that maintenance work. And at the end of the day, trees on private property is the homeowner's responsibility. And that is a much larger issue that we're even like, how do we help people, right? Because trees are an infrastructure for a city that are capturing stormwater and reducing the burden on the energy grid. But yet that homeowner is responsible for maintaining that tree. So these are larger questions that we're posing to big thinkers like Christine, other university researchers, law professors. What can be done to help people as we look at urban forestry where, those trees on property are doing a service, and what can we do about it? But you're engaging in very long-term understanding and resources.
Yeah, I will just put a plug for step number 5 in the book. Chapter 3 talks about following up. And so there's a huge importance about following up with people and saying, how's it going with the tree? What do you need? Instead of expecting people to reach out to an institution or people that they may not trust or they may not feel comfortable with. So it's basically taking the onus off of them and taking responsibility for the follow-up as someone who's trying to be helpful. So I think that's really crucial is getting past that, okay, we planted the tree and that's it, we're done. It's more, following up. Yeah, well, thank you all so much for coming to this. This is our first circuit. So thank you. And Shane, I believe we're doing signing now.
Yes. So we will do signing up here at the front. We do have books available for sale at the desk. So if you would like to purchase a copy, we have plenty available. And I want to thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Definitely be sure to look at our event calendar for some upcoming events because we have some really exciting upcoming events coming up, still even in February and in March.
Oh, you can do though, really.
Yeah, this week, Monday.
Oh, good.
Good.
Glad you
I think
enjoyed
that
it.
we,
Tessa, right?
connect with that.
Yes.
Yes, please. I'm excited about this. How you doing?
Is this stuff in the way or is it okay? Yeah.
Good to see you.